I had $11 and a slab of bluestone the size of a wagon bed, and the second of those was the only one anybody in Cobb Hollow thought worth talking about, though they talked about it the way you talk about a stain. It was the third week of September in the year 1884, and the morning my brother-in-law set my chest down at the edge of the old quarry track and told me the house had passed him and his wife. By the plain reading of my late husband's paper, I did not argue, because there was no paper of mine to set against his, and a woman with no paper in that county was a woman with no roof. He was not cruel about it. That is the thing people forget when they tell this story now. Harlan said it the way a man reads weather, flat and certain, and already turned half away, and his wife stood in the door behind him with her hands folded the way you fold them in church, and the door closed, and that was the whole of my dispossession. No shouting, a latch dropping into its keeper. I stood in the road with a chest, a hen named Patience under one arm, and a dog named Bell at my heel, and I looked back up the slope at the quarry my father had worked until the day his lungs gave out, and I did not yet understand that the worst-looking ground in that valley was the only thing I had been left that would hold a single life through what was coming. You will hear before this is over exactly how cold a January can be made to count, and exactly how many it counted. Stay with me, and you will see who said what at the threshold, and you will see what I did with a stone floor that the whole hollow swore was a grave I was digging for myself. Then I will go back to the beginning, where it belongs. The beginning was my father, Eli, and his hands and the quarry. He was a stonecutter who had come up from the Cumberland country with nothing but a maul, a set of feathers and wedges, and a way of reading a seam of rock that I never saw fail him. My mother died when I was 9, and after that it was the two of us in the stone, and he taught me the trade, the way other fathers taught their daughters to keep a still room, which is to say, completely, without ever once saying he was teaching me anything. He showed me how bluestone splits along its bed and balks against its grain. He showed me how the ground stays warm a long way down after the air has gone bitter, how a cellar dug deep enough and capped right will sit at the temperature of the earth itself and never freeze, no matter what the sky is doing. He used to put his bare hand flat on the quarry face in February and say the rock was holding last summer in it, holding it patient, and that a man who understood that could keep food and keep warm, where a man who only understood fire would burn through his woodpile and starve in the dark. He left me no money, he left me that. The only inheritance worth having is the kind that lives in the hands, and he had emptied his into mine without either of us calling it a gift. I remember one February in particular, the year I was 12, when the snow stood to the window sills and the cold had a tooth to it that made the nails in the wall snap like green wood in a fire. My father took me by the wrist that morning and walked me up to the quarry face and made me lay my bare hand flat on the stone where the wind had been scouring it all night, and I flinched because I expected the burn of ice, and instead the rock gave my palm a faint, dull warmth, the way a banked stove does through a closed door. He watched my face change. He said the air was a liar and the ground was not, that the air would tell you the world had gone to killing cold, while 3 feet down the same world was still keeping last August safe, and that the whole trade of staying alive in our country came down to knowing which of the two to believe. He kept a stone-lined pit under his shop floor for our own keeping, and that same winter he lifted the cover and brought up apples that should by every right have been brown mush and were instead hard and sweet and beaded with cold. And he handed me one and watched me bite it, and he said nothing because the apple said it for him. I have eaten a great many things in a long life, and I have never forgotten the taste of that one, an apple that the calendar said was impossible. The frost line he never drew on paper for me. He drew it in my hand with a cold stone and a sound apple. And a thing learned that way does not wash out. I had married Tom Sayer at 19 and gone to live in his snug frame house on the good flat ground at the bottom of the hollow, and for 11 years I had been a wife with a parlor and a churn and no particular need of my father's stone, and I had let the trade settle in me like a tool laid in a drawer. Then Tom took a fever in the spring of '84 that no one could name and was gone in 9 days, and the house and the flat ground were his brothers by the paper. And I was 30 and landless in the same season the apples set. People in the hollow were sorry for me in the way of people who are relieved it is not them. They brought ham and they brought bread, and they went home to their own warm kitchens, and not one of them thought past October, because not one of them had stood at a quarry face in February, with a dead man's hand pressed to the rock. The quarry track ran up to a shelf of ground my father had half worked out, a wide, flat apron of blue stone with the overburden long since stripped off it, and above the apron a low bench where the seam ran back into the hillside under a caps of soil maybe 4 feet thick. Nobody wanted it. It had passed to me through my mother's line and stayed mine through every paper because it was worth nothing to anyone who meant to farm or graze or build a frame house, which was everyone. It was the one thing the county had not bothered to take. The way you leave a bent nail on the ground. I walked up to it that first afternoon, with Belle ranging ahead of me through the broom sedge and Patience clucking her outrage under my arm, and I stood on the stone apron and felt, through my boot soles, that the rock was still holding the summer. And I began to plan a house that was not a house, in the only way I knew how, which was the way my father would have done it. I would not build up. Building up meant timber I could not buy, and a frame I could not raise alone before the cold, and a wooden room is a box that fights the weather every hour of every day and loses a little each time. I would build down and in. I would cut a chamber back into the seam under that 4-foot cap of earth, floor it with the bluestone that was already there, wall it with dry laid stone, and set a low fire chamber at one end with a stone flue drawn up through the cap so the smoke went out but the heat stayed in the mass of the rock and the earth. And beneath the floor of it, before I laid a single flag, I would sink my cache, the whole of my winter's food, down into the cold ground where it would keep without freezing and without spoiling, because the earth that will not let the cold all the way down in January is the same earth that will not let the summer heat all the way down in August. My father had kept a barrel of apples sound until May that way, in a stone-lined pit under his shop, and I had eaten them, and I knew the taste of February apples that should have been mush and were instead crisp as the day they dropped. I knew it in my mouth. The words for it came second. Hollis Pratt owned the store at the crossroads and a good half of the opinions in Cobb Hollow, and he was the first to put a name on what I was doing. I had come down for lime and a keg of nails, the little money I had going out of my hand a coin at a time, and the men on his porch watched me load the sledge, and Hollis leaned in the doorframe with a toothpick worked into the corner of his mouth and said, loud enough to carry, that the Sayer widow had gone up to the old quarry to dig herself a grave and was buying lime to do it tidy. The porch laughed. It was not a hard laugh. That was the worst of it. How easy it was, how little it cost them. He called it the grave that afternoon, and he meant the structure, and he meant me both. And the word went down the hollow ahead of me and was waiting at every gate. From that day, to many of them, I was the widow digging her grave, and the thing I was building was the grave, and the kindest of them softened it only to the hole. I want to tell you the laughing did not reach me, but I was 30 and freshly landless and burying my husband's spring still in my chest, and a thing said easy by a porch full of men is a wind that finds every gap you have. It reached me. I went back up the track, and I put my father's lesson between myself and it, the way you put a wall between yourself and a wind, and I dug. If you have ever been written off by people who never had to be right about you, you know the particular quiet of working where they cannot see, and you know how a body can lean into labor until the labor is the only voice left. Stay near and watch what the laughing was actually standing on. I dug into that hillside through the back end of September, with Belle asleep on the warm cut stone, and Patience scratching the spoil heap for grubs, and the deeper I went, the warmer the ground gave back, and I knew before October that my father had been right, because the rock was holding the summer for me exactly as he said it would. The work was slow, and it was particular, and most of it would have looked, to a man on the porch, like a woman fussing in the dirt. I cut the chamber back 11 feet into the seam and squared it to 8 feet wide, and I went down 4 feet below the natural floor, so the whole room sat deep in the rock with the earth cap thick above it. The cap was the thing. My father used to say a roof of earth, 4 feet deep, does not care what the air does. That the frost in our country drove down maybe 2 feet and 3 in a hard year, and never 4, never 4, and that everything you wanted to keep alive through a winter wanted to live below the frost line, and nowhere else. So I kept the floor of my chamber a full 2 feet below where the worst frost could reach, and into that floor, dead center, I sank the cache. I dug a pit the size of a small room within the room, lined it with dry stone, and floored and walled it so the cold ground touched my food on every side, but the cold air never did. Into it went everything: potatoes and turnips and beets in dry sand, apples in straw not touching, cabbages hung by the root, a barrel of salt pork and a barrel of meal and a crock of lard and a wheel of cheese a neighbor woman named Sarah Combs had pressed on me when no one was looking, the only kindness in the hollow that came without a backward glance. I capped the pit with bluestone flags cut to fit, dry set so I could lift them, and over the flags I laid the floor of the chamber itself, so that I would walk and sleep and tend my fire directly above my whole winter, with 2 feet of earth-warmed stone between me and the keeping of it. The cold could not find it, the damp could not rot it. It lay in the dark at the temperature of the deep ground, which is the temperature of patience, and it waited. I worked alone at all of it through October, and the labor was not gentle. The bluestone came up in flags when it would, and in nothing when it would not, and I learned my father's hands all over again through my own aching ones, the trick of the feathers and wedges set in a drilled line so the stone parted along its bed clean instead of shattering, the trick of leverage that let a woman move a slab a strong man would have grunted at, not by force but by patience and a fulcrum, and the rock's own willingness to go where its grain wanted. I dry laid the walls without a spoonful of mortar, each stone chosen for the seat it would take on the one below it, bonded across the joints the way my father bonded a retaining wall so the whole face stood by its own weight and could not be pushed in, and into the back of the chamber I set the low fire shelf of solid stone that would take the heat of a small fire into its mass and give it back for hours after the flame was out. The flue I cut last and cut most carefully, a narrow stone throat drawn up at a slant through the 4-foot cap, wide enough to draw the smoke, out clean and turned enough that it carried the smoke and not the warmth, because a chimney that pulls too hard robs the room of the very heat you lit the fire to make. I had seen chimneys that roared and rooms that stayed cold behind them, and I had seen my father's low, slow flues that whispered and left a shop warm at midnight on banked coals, and I built the second kind. Sarah Combs came up the track in the second week of October with the cheese under her shawl and stood at the mouth of my dug chamber looking in at the lamp-lit stone, and she did not laugh. She was a small, sharp-eyed woman who had buried 2 husbands and 3 children and kept her own counsel the way other people keep money, and she looked a long time at the way the flue drew the smoke up, clean through the earth cap, and left the room warm and clear, and at the cash flags set flush in the floor, and she said only that her grandmother in the old country had wintered a family in a stone and earth house dug into a hillside, and that the priest had buried fewer of that village than of any other in the bad years. Then she said the thing I have carried longest. She said, "You are not digging down to die. You are digging down to where the dying does not reach." And she helped me set the last flags. And she went home and she told no one, because she had learned a long time ago that a thing the hollow does not understand is a thing the hollow will trample. And she meant to let it grow in the dark a while yet. The middle of October brought the institutional eye in the person of a young man named Wade Foss, who rode the county for the land office, recording improvements and copying boundaries into a leather book he carried in a saddlebag. He came up my track because the quarry shelf showed fresh work, and fresh work meant a line to redraw, and he sat his horse at the mouth of my chamber and looked in with the frank curiosity of a man whose whole trade was writing down what people actually did instead of what they said they did. He asked me to explain the flu, and I explained it. He asked me how I meant to keep food in a hole, and I told him about the frost line and the deep ground and the summer held in the rock. And he got down off his horse and went in and put his hand on the wall the way my father used to. And I watched him feel it, the warmth where there should have been cold. And I watched him decide to believe his hand over the porch. He wrote it down. He drew the chamber in his leather book with the cash pit shaded in below the floor, and he asked the date of completion, and he asked, almost shy, whether he might come back in the deep of winter and see whether it held. I said he might. I did not know I was speaking to the man who would carry the whole of it forward into the next century. I thought he was a clerk with a kind hand and a good book. Hollis Pratt found a second occasion at the church social on the last Sunday in October, where the hollow gathered in the meeting house yard with baskets, and the talk turned, as it does in a poor year, to who was ready for winter and who was not. Somebody asked after the Sayer widow, and Hollis, with a chicken leg in his hand and the whole yard for an audience, said she was the readiest of all of them, that she had dug her grave and stocked it and only wanted the weather to climb in. And he laughed, and the yard laughed with him. And a man named Asa Teen, who farmed the next ridge and had a hard practical streak, said it was a shame, a woman alone throwing her last dollars down a hole when she might have boarded decent with a family for the keep of her labor. He did not say it to wound. He said it the way men say the obvious. The grave, Hollis called it again, and the meeting house yard fastened the word to me a second time, and the only person who spoke against it was Sarah Combs, who said quietly that she had seen the work and it was sound and was talked over and let it go, because she knew what I was only beginning to learn, that the hollow would not hear a word against its own settled joke until something larger than a word came to unsettle it. What came was the winter of '84 and '85, and it came first as a wrongness in the light. The last week of November ran warm and false, warm enough that men left their wood half-ranked and their chinking half-pointed. And then on the 1st of December, the sky to the northwest went the color of a healed bruise, and the geese that had lingered all went up at once. And southward in a hurry that no one mistook, I had seen my father read that sky. I brought Belle in and shut Patience in her box in the warm chamber and went out and stood on my stone apron and felt the air change against my face, the way it goes thin and metal before a great cold. And I went back down into my room under 4 feet of earth, and I waited because there was nothing left to do that I had not done in October. The hollow scrambled. I could hear it faintly, the axes going late, and the wagons on the crossroads road, hauling the wood that should have been hauled in September, and over it the wind beginning. And I sat by my low stone fire with my dog and my hen, and 2 feet of held summer under my feet, and I was not afraid in the way they were afraid, and that is the whole difference this story is about. The cold came down on the 3rd of December, and it did not lift for 19 days. The first night of it, I lay awake on my quilt above the cache and listened to the 4 feet of earth over me do its work, the wind tearing across the apron above with a sound like a saw in green oak, and below that sound nothing, a stillness in the rock that the storm could not reach down into. By the second morning, the snow had filled my entry, and I dug it back and propped a stone slab as a windbreak and dug no more, because the drift was banking the doorway into another layer of shelter, and I let it. I kept my father's habit of a nail scratched on the wall for each dawn, and I counted 19, and the men who later set instruments to such things in that part of the country put the worst night at 31 degrees below naught, and I do not doubt it, because on the worst night the greenwood the Pratts were burning froze sap-solid in their lean-to and would not catch, and Hollis Pratt, who had a name for every fool but himself, sent his oldest boy a mile through that wind to the Combs place to beg coals, and the boy came, and Sarah Combs gave him coals in a covered pot, and told him where the warm house was if it came to that, and sent him home. The hollow burned through its wood the way a frightened man burns through his money. Asa Tyne, who had pitied me my whole, lost 9 head of cattle standing in their own field, frozen on their feet in the dark, and burned his rail fences to keep his children warm. And when the fences were gone, he burned a corn crib. And when that was gone, he stood in his door in the gray of the worst morning and did not know what he would burn next. Down in the good flat house that had been mine, Harlan and his wife huddled in one room around a stove that ate cordwood faster than he could split it frozen, and the frame walls that had fought the weather every hour of every easy year lost to it now, and the cold came through the chinking and stood in the corners, and their water pails skinned with ice 8 feet from the fire. That is the arithmetic. 9 cattle and a corn crib and a fence on one ridge. A boy sent a mile for coals, a pail freezing by a stove, and up the quarry track in a hole the whole hollow had laughed at, the air against my hand held at 52 degrees by the deep ground, my fire a low banked thing I fed a few sticks a day, my potatoes crisp and my apples sound, and my dog stretched flat on the warm floor with her chin on my foot, while above us 4 feet of earth through the worst winter in living memory, off the way a steep roof throws rain. I was not alone in it as long as I had planned to be. On the 9th night of the cold, with the worst of it not yet come, I heard a sound at my chamber mouth that was not the wind, and I went up with the lamp and found Sarah Combs and the Tyning family, all 6 of them, the youngest a girl of 4, wrapped to the eyes, standing in the snow that the wind had driven halfway up my entry. Asa Tyne had burned his last fence. Sarah had walked them up the track in the dark because she knew, she said, that the only warm house in Cobb Hollow was the one nobody would come to out of shame. I brought them down into the rock. I will not make a scene of it because there was no scene to make. There was a man who had called my home a fool's errand standing in the middle of it, with his frozen children looking at the lamp-warm walls and the flue drawing clean and the steam coming off his own coat, and there was nothing for him to say, and so for a long while he said nothing. His wife, a quiet woman named Della, got the children's wet boots off by the fire and rubbed their feet between her hands, and the color came back into them slow, and she watched it come back and did not trust it, kept rubbing long after she needed to, the way you do when you have spent a night not knowing. I lifted the center flags and brought up apples and pork and meal from the cache, and the warmth of the deep ground came up out of the open pit into the room, a breath of held summer rising into a December night, and Asa Teeny stood over the open floor and looked down into it at the sound food lying in the dark, where he had been sure only a grave could be, and his jaw worked once, and he said nothing still. The 4-year-old, Effie, fell asleep on my quilt with Belle curled against her back before her mother had her own coat off. I fed 7 people and a dog and a hen out of the hole in my floor for the back 10 days of that cold, and the food kept coming up sound, and not one of us took any harm. Wade Foss came on the 17th day, when the cold had cracked just enough to let a man ride, and he came up the track expecting to record a death, because the hollow below had told him the widow's grave had surely closed over her by now. He found 9 people, counting himself and a neighbor he had brought to help dig out what he thought he would have to dig out, sitting warm in a stone room under the earth with a fire that wanted almost no feeding. And he stood in my doorway with the cold at his back and the warmth on his face, and he took off his hat. He was a young man, and he did not have a young man's words for it. He looked at the cash pit, standing open in the floor, and the sound food in it, and he looked at Asa Teen, who had buried 9 cattle and saved 6 children in a hole he had mocked, and he looked at me, and after a long quiet, Asa Teen was the one who spoke, not Foss. Asa Teen, who had called it a hole and pitied me for it in the meeting house yard, stood up off the warm stone and said the only thing that needed saying. He said, "You knew the ground," 3 words. Then he sat back down because his legs were not steady, and he put his face in his hands, not weeping exactly, but the way a man does when a thing he was sure of has been taken out from under him gently and set right side up. The room held its quiet a long while after that. Nobody filled it. The fire ticked and the wind eased off the earth above us, and Effie slept on with the dog, and I understood, sitting there, that the account my father in my hands the day he died had finally been paid out, and that it had been paid to 7 living people and not to me, and that this was exactly as he would have wanted it. The cold broke on the 22nd of December, and the hollow came up out of its frozen houses to count its losses. And the count was bad. 4 people died in Cobb Hollow that winter. An old man named Pruitt, who lived alone and would not leave his cold frame house, and 3 others on the far ridges. And every one of them died of fire run out, or a house that could not hold. And not one of them died of hunger, because hunger is slower than cold, and the cold took them first. Asa Teen did not lose a child. He said so plainly to anyone who would hear, all that spring, and he was not a man given to talk. And the hollow listened to him in a way it had never listened to Sarah Combs, because he was one of their own confident men brought over, and a doubter converted preaches harder than any believer born. By March, men who had laughed on Hollis Pratt's porch were coming up my quarry track with their hats in their hands to look at the flue and the cap and the cash pit, and I showed them. I had no wish to keep it. I showed every one of them how deep the frost drove, and how much deeper the floor had to sit, how thick the cap, how the flue must draw the smoke without drawing the heat, how the cache wanted dry stone on every side and never a board, because a board rots and a board carries the cold and the stone does neither. The only inheritance worth having is the kind that lives in the hands, and I had learned that a thing kept in the hands and not given out dies there, so I gave it out. Not all of them understood it, and that is its own small lesson. Some copied only the look of the thing, dug shallow holes, and roofed them thin and floored them with plank, because plank was easier than cut stone, and their holes froze, and their food spoiled, and they came back up the track confused, and I had to teach them the second time that it was the depth and the mass and the stone they had skimped, that the principle was not the hole, but what the hole reached down to. The ones who grasped that built true and wintered safe. The ones who only copied the shape of my luck went cold a second time. My father had told me without the words that understanding travels and imitation does not, and I watched it prove out across that hollow over the next several winters as plainly as a sum on a slate. The depth was the inheritance. The stone was the inheritance. The frost line my father carried in his hands like a second heartbeat was the inheritance. And the ones who took the trouble to learn it kept it. And the ones who wanted the warm room without the cold labor of understanding did not. Wade Foss carried it furthest, and that is the part of this that outran my own life. He wrote it all into his leather book that winter, the chamber and the cap and the cash pit and the frost line. And when the Agricultural Society in the county seat asked the next year for reports on how households had come through the great cold, he gave them mine, drawn and measured and explained, and they printed it, and it went out of the hollow and into places I never saw. Men I never met built stone and earth winter chambers off a diagram that began with a young clerk's hand pressed flat to my wall, and they kept their food and their families through cold that would have killed them in a frame box, and not one of them knew my name, which is as it should be, because the thing was never mine. It was my father's, and it was his father's country before him. And it was the deep grounds first of all, and I was only the woman who happened to be standing on the right worthless stone in the right bad year with the right dead man's lesson in her hands. I lived in that chamber for 31 years. I want you to sit with the length of that, because the hollow that called it a grave watched me make it a home, and then a known thing, and then an ordinary thing, until children who were born after that winter grew up thinking a warm stone room dug into the hillside was simply how careful people kept a winter, and did not know there had ever been a porch full of men laughing at the woman who dug the first one. The seasons turned over that shelf the way they turn over everything, and each one buried the laughter a little deeper. Belle lived 12 good years and died on the warm floor in her sleep, and I buried her up on the apron in the sun, and I kept dogs after her, dark and steady ones, and there was always one stretched on the stone when the cold came. Sarah Combs and I were friends until she died, and she never once said she had told me so, because she had not. She had only seen, and seeing without crowing is the rarest grace I have known in a person. Asatine sent his daughter Effie to help me when my own back went, and Effie learned the trade off me the way I learned it off my father. Hands first and words second, and she dug chambers of her own for families on 3 ridges. And when I was very old, she was the one who put her hand flat on my wall and told me it was still holding the summer, the way it always had. Harlan kept the good flat house at the bottom of the hollow and farmed the easy ground, and we were civil. And I never said a hard word to him about the latch dropping into its keeper on a September morning, because the catastrophe had said everything that needed saying about whose roof held and whose did not, and a person who has been proven right by a whole winter has no need to be proven right by her own mouth. He came up the track once, years on, an old man by then, and stood in my warm room a while, and looked at the cash flags worn smooth by my feet, and said it was a good house. That was all. I let it be all. The grace I had to give him was the same grace Sarah gave me, which was to say nothing and let the warm room speak. I am an old woman now, and the chamber is still up there on the quarry shelf, dug back into the bluestone seam under 4 feet of earth, and they tell me it still sits warm in January, though no one has kept a fire in it for years, because the deep ground does not forget what it was taught to hold, and neither, it turns out, do people, if you teach them right. Effie's grandchildren keep food in it yet. If you went up the old quarry track today, past where the broom sedge has come back over the spoil heaps, you would find a low stone doorway in the side of the hill, with the lintel my father's hand could have cut, and you would feel, stepping in out of the cold, the summer my father swore the rock was holding it patient, holding it still. That is the whole of what I was left, and the whole of what I gave away, and the whole of what is keeping warm up there in the dark, while everything that laughed has gone to grass. The ground keeps what you teach it to keep. My father taught me that with his hands, and I have taught it to you with mine, and now it is yours to keep or to let go cold. Up on the shelf the doorway stands open to the snow, and behind it the dark holds its warmth the way it was shown how, and does not let the dying reach.